Hi, everybody. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about our first system. This is called the integumentary system. So let's just load this up. Whoops, there we go. And take a look. All right. So here's what we're looking at today for the integumentary system. We're going to be considering the equivalent of the skin, but we're only going to be considering the epidermis, the dermis, and the associated structures. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of different types of structures. We've got the hairs, we've got blood vessels, we have sebaceous glands, we have muscles that control the hairs in your skin. So we're going to see examples of all four different categories of tissue types today. Okay, so integument covers your body. It also goes by the synonym, the cutaneous membrane. So you remember we talked about membranes. I said that those are going to include epithelial and connective. Okay, so that's just the epidermis and the dermis. We're going to add into that the additional structures found within, which is going to include nerves and muscle tissues. Okay, so the integumentary system consists of the skin and all of its derivatives, such as nails, hair, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, a bunch of different things. Okay, in general, looking at the four different types of tissues, we have the epithelium, which is superficial most. And this tissue helps to protect and defend the underlying layer for reasons that we talked about with all epithelial tissues, how they're very close together, they have very little matrix, they're avascular. Deep to the epithelium, we're going to find the connective tissues that are vascular, so that's where we're going to find the blood vessels. And we're also going to see lots of protein structures that give resilience and strength to the integumentary system. Within these layers, we're going to find smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is the involuntary muscle, and that's going to affect the diameter of blood vessels. So diameter is how wide they are. So smooth muscles can control how much blood flows to the surface of the skin, and also the position of hair on the body. And finally, a small neural component, we're looking at sensory receptors in the skin, such as pain receptors, heat receptors, so forth. So let's start with the two layers. The epidermis, of course, is superficial most, and the specific epidermal tissue is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Deep to the epidermis is the dermis. Now, this connective tissue is largely made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. We didn't study dense, irregular connective tissue, but it is another connective tissue that is packed full of protein fibers. Unlike the dense regular connective tissue, however, there's not as much collagen fiber, and it has more vascularization to it than you would find in dense regular connective tissue. Now, deep to the dermis is a third layer that is not part of the integumentary system called the hypodermis. So it's confusing sometimes because the terminology sounds pretty similar, but it just means below or deep to the dermis. Now we're going to start with the epidermis. Okay, the epidermis is all of this, all the way down to this basal layer that sits on the basal lamina. Okay, so where I'm tracing with the arrow, that's the basal lamina. So all these tissues that are superficial to the basal lamina are going to be the epidermis. Now the epidermis, notice it looks different as you move from the deepest to the most superficial, and these different layers are called strata. So if stratification means layering, then strata, these are the layers. So we're going to see the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and finally stratum basal. Okay, now, of course, synonyms, plenty of them. A synonym for stratum basal is stratum germinativum. So stratum basal means it's the basement layer, it's the deepest layer. And germinativum, think of that as being related to the word to germinate. So if you germinate a seed, plant a seed, and a plant starts to grow. So this is the area from which growth occurs. It is a one cell layer thick layer, here, tissue, and it sits on the basement membrane, and it is very rich in stem cells. These particular stem cells are called basal cells. Okay, so these are the stem cells of the epidermis. They're going to undergo very rapid mitosis, replacing themselves as new basal cells and producing the cells that we're going to see in the superficial most layers. In addition, you're going to find some extra cell types called melanocytes and Merkel cells that I'll talk about some more in a second. Okay, superficial to the stratum germinativum, here showed in this sort of pale pink color, is known as the stratum spinosum. It's named because when people first looked at it under a microscope, it looked spiny, had a little spiky look to it. And it turns out this spiky look is due to the cell junctions. Remember, these are the connections formed between neighboring cells. So when people first prepared this tissue, the tissue would be slightly dehydrated. It would lose some water. And so you could really see the junctions because these would stand out as the cells shrunk. So eventually we figured out why it had a spiny look, but the name stuck. These are daughter cells resulting from mitosis of basal cells. So when a basal cell replicates, it makes a new basal cell, and it makes a daughter cell. And the daughter cells are slowly pushed up toward the surface by new daughter cells being created by mitosis. So these are the oldest cells. Sorry, these are the newest cells, and these are the oldest cells. Okay, in addition, in the stratum spinosum here, we're going to talk briefly about this extra cell type that you see here called a Langerhans cell, or sometimes referred to by the synonym epidermal dendritic. All right, moving up to the third layer. If you look at this layer, you'll see even in this drawing that these cells look like they have sort of these little, I don't know, pieces of sand in them, these little grains. So it's called the stratum granulosum. So this is where the cells start to fill up with this granular material. And what this is the accumulation of keratin. So remember, this is a keratinized tissue. So the keratin is starting to fill up the cells, and that's what gives them that kind of opaque look. So keratinization's really begun here. The fourth layer is called stratum lucidum. The word lucid or lucidum, this means clear. And notice that we have this just a few cell layers thick, this layer of clear tissue. And this is only going to occur in one type of skin that we'll define later called thick skin. And then the last one is the uppermost layer here. And notice these cells are entirely dead, as are the cells from the stratum lucidum. So these dead cells are referred to as the stratum corneum. So think of like a corn on your foot. Okay, it's a spot where you've accumulated a lot of dead skin. So these dead keratinized cells are going to be the part of the skin that comes into contact with the environment. So if you were to touch your skin anywhere on your body right now, what you're touching are dead cells. Now, skin can be thick or thin depending on the region of the body. So if you look here on the left, notice that the stratum corneum is very, very thick. There's lots and lots of dead skin. So where on your body do you have a lot of dead skin? Well, the most obvious is the bottom of your foot. Even if you like to get pedicures, you accumulate dead skin on the bottoms of your feet. And the other area where you have thick skin is actually on the palms of your hands. Elsewhere on the body, the layer of stratum corneum is much thinner. Now take a look at this. You've just got a couple cell layers here. This might be what you'd find on the inside of your arm or on your neck or another area where the skin is quite delicate and thin. So thin skin is defined as the epidermis that covers most of the body. So this includes everywhere on the outside of your skin except the palms of your hand and the bottoms of your feet. What's unusual about the thin epidermis is it lacks the stratum lucidum. So it has only 4 layers. It goes straight from the stratum granulosum went too fast. There we go. It goes straight from the stratum granulosum up to the stratum corneum. And mostly you just can't really perceive that very thin, delicate layer. So it's not considered to be part of thin skin. Thin skin also has a difference in that it has hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands. So if you look on your arm right now, you're going to see little hairs there, or maybe lots of hairs there. But even somebody with very fair hair is going to have some light dusting of fine hair. And yet, if you compare that to the palm of your hand, you should not see any hair follicles. I've never seen anybody with hair follicles on the palm of their hand. So that is another difference between the thin and the thick skin. Also, sebaceous glands and sweat glands are both found on thin skin. All right, now let's compare that to the thick skin, okay, which is found, as I said, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and this also includes the palmar and the sole surface of your fingers and toes. So if you think about how humans move around the environment, we walk around our environment mostly, or we use our hands to help climb, say, rocks or trees, and we wrap our fingers around branches, or we wrap our toes around rocks to get a grip. I'm talking about somebody, of course, who's not wearing shoes, but I'm talking about how humans evolved in the environment. These are the areas of the body that come in direct contact with the environment and are most likely to get scraped up or be an area where you might get an injury and then possibly have bacteria or something getting into the body. So having a very thick layer of dead skin covering those surfaces makes a lot of sense to protect you. Okay, so we are going to have a stratum lucidum in the thick skin. No hair, as I mentioned, but one more thing's missing here, and these are the sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair, but you do have sweat glands. Anybody who's ever been nervous and got sweaty hands or sweaty feet knows that you're perfectly capable of producing sweat, but you're not going to have the oily sebum or the hair that you associate with thin skin. All right, what does skin or the integumentary system do for you? Well, it has a lot of functions, actually. It protects the deeper layers from molecules. These could be poisons or bacteria or fungi, all kinds of things. Also protects the deeper layers from UV radiation. We'll talk about that. Integumentary system reduces water loss. It's kind of awful to think about, but people who suffer from third-degree burns when the integumentary system is destroyed suffer from tremendous dehydration. So you will evaporate water extremely quickly if you don't have skin. All right, skin also helps in the regulation of temperature via evaporation. So we're talking here about sweating. So as you sweat, the water released on your skin evaporates. To go from a liquid to a gas requires energy. So your body donates energy in the form of heat to convert water from a liquid to a gas. So in order to cool off, we sweat. You can get the same effect if you sprinkle water on your skin. As you cool off, you're going to lose body heat. All right, the production of vitamin D3 is an important metabolic function, but basically you need vitamin D3 in order to absorb calcium. and you make vitamin D3 when you are exposed to the sun. Okay, so that's another function of the skin. Then those Langerhans cells that I mentioned, we won't go into them in too much detail, but they carry out immune defense. The Merkel cells I mentioned earlier are sensory receptor cells. And we'll talk about the melanocytes a little bit more when we get into UV radiation and the protection from UV radiation. And then finally, the last function of the skin is to excrete waste products, particularly salts. So after a hot day, if you just lick the inside of your wrist, right, after you've been sweating, it's going to taste salty. That's because sweat includes a lot of salt. But actually, there's another waste product that comes out through salt, and that is urea. It's not urine, but urea is a molecule that allows your body to get rid of nitrogen. And it turns out that getting rid of nitrogen is not an easy thing to do. Nitrogen tends to form the more toxic chemicals that your body can't tolerate. So urine is loaded with nitrogen, but you can also dump some of that through your skin as urea. All right, so let's look now at the hands and the feet, the thick skin, and you're gonna see the formation of friction ridges. We know these mostly as fingerprints, but they're not just limited to the tips of your fingers. They're all over, all of your thick skin has these friction ridges. And so they're on your fingers, palms, soles of your feet, and the toes. And you can see some different examples here that we've given names to define what they look like. But how do you get these friction ridges and what do they do? Well, they are formed by folds and valleys. So a fold and a valley would just be kind of an up and down pattern of dermal and epidermal tissues. So your fingerprints are not only on your epidermis, they go down deep into the dermis. So if you were a criminal long ago, before DNA, but after fingerprinting, some people would attempt to destroy their fingerprints so they couldn't be caught. But that's a pretty painful procedure because it requires that you not only destroy the epidermis, but also the dermis. Okay, so you didn't want to do that. But why do we have friction ridges? Well, it's thought that these help humans to move around their environment by increasing friction. Okay, they give you greater contact between your skin and whatever it is you're holding or climbing or pushing against. All right, so those are your fingerprints and other friction ridges. Now, skin color. Skin color is a pretty loaded topic, and normally one that I want to talk about from the biological perspective. I am not talking about race from a social perspective. I am just talking about why it is that humans come in different colors. And so if you want to determine what gives an individual his or her skin color, here's a couple of things that contribute. First of all, hemoglobin. Now hemoglobin, excuse me, let me have a drink quick. Okay, hemoglobin is a protein, and it's a protein found in erythrocytes or red blood cells. Okay, so here's an artery, here is a vein. They're represented as two different colors. And the reason for this is that in red is going to be the brighter blood because hemoglobin that binds with oxygen turns bright red. The hemoglobin can also bond with carbon dioxide, but when it does, it's a darker color. It's not really blue. That's not very accurate, but inside your veins, it has a bluish look. So if you see arterial blood, which hopefully you have not because you need a pretty serious injury to see that, it is a much brighter color. So how does that reflect your skin color? Well, the more blood that is flowing at or near the surface of your skin, the more of a reddish pink hue you will have. And we've all flushed with embarrassment or been red in the face because we're hot. And even somebody who's naturally quite dark skinned will show this pinkish color under those conditions. But of course, if you've got less melanin, if your skin color is lighter, then it's easier to see the effects of hemoglobin. All right, now melanin. Melanin is produced by melanocytes. So here's that melanocyte. And if you remember, that was found in the basal strata or the stratum germinativum. So way down at the bottom of the epidermis. And it's a very large cell compared to the rest of them. It looks to me almost like, I don't know, like some kind of a sea monster or an octopus, because it has these long branches that look a bit like the legs of an octopus. Okay, and what it does is it produces a pigment. And if you remember, I told you before that melanin, this pigment, is considered an inclusion and is part of the cytosol of a cell because it is insoluble. It does not dissolve in the contents of the cell. So this big melanocyte is going to be making vesicles that are filled up with melanin. And then these vesicles are going to be deposited in the cells surrounding the melanocyte. So the secretions from the melanocyte end up in the neighboring cells. What is melanin? Well, as I said, it's a pigment. That's something with color. And melanin comes in different shades. There's not just one version of melanin. There's reds to more yellowish browns to darker bluish blacks. It really just varies, and it depends on your genetics, both what color and how much you make. Okay, and it's pretty obvious to everybody that if you spend time in the sun, you get darker. No matter what your natural coloring is, you will darken in the sun. And that's because when you're exposed to UV radiation, your melanocytes make more melanin. Okay, so here's that melanocyte, and it's depositing melanin in these surrounding cells. Now, these cells are known as keratinocytes. Now, these are the squamous epithelial tissues we learned about, but this specific cell, remember, can fill up later with keratin. So the ones that are found here in the epidermis are also known as keratinocytes because later they will fill up with keratin. But now we're in the deepest layers. We're down in the stratum germinativum and the stratum spinosum. So these cells are alive. Now notice that the melanin inside the keratinocytes is accumulating superior to the nucleus. Okay, what's in the nucleus? Well, remember there's something really important in there, which is the DNA. DNA can be damaged by UV radiation. UV radiation is quite dangerous to DNA. It can cause mistakes in how you make proteins. So if you change the letters of the DNA, you can make your proteins wrong. The melanin helps to prevent damage to the DNA by radiation. So the more melanin and the darker the melanin, the less damage can occur to the DNA. Now, if you consider where humans evolved, where maybe your ancestors or my ancestors came from, a lot of us are a mix from all over the world. But if you have ancestors who evolved in an area where there was very high UV radiation, such as near the equator, then you are likely to make more and darker melanin. That is, your skin color will be darker. If, on the other hand, you evolved from humans who lived near the poles where they got less UV radiation, then they would produce less and lighter melanin. So it gives you some understanding for how skin colors evolved. The final contributor to skin color is called keratin. And keratin is derived from your diet. You get it from your food. Items high in keratin would include things like carrots or sweet potatoes. They're usually a yellowy orange in color, and they contribute color to your skin. And you can see this if you want to go on YouTube and look at what happens to people when they drink too much carrot juice. You can actually turn yourself a lovely shade of orange. This is reversible, but it'll give you an idea of how it contributes. So it's not a huge contributor, but it is part of skin color. Obviously, melanin is the big contributor to skin color in humans. All right, so that's this layer up here. Okay, that's the epidermis. Now, we're going to go into the deeper dermis where there's a lot more structures found. Okay, the dermis is going to be made up of connective tissue. And if you remember, there were several different types of tissues that were considered to be connective tissue proper. So it's not just one type of tissue that makes up the dermis, obviously. But also, we're going to find blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair follicles, nail roots, sensory nerve endings, and muscles. Now, these muscles, as I said, can determine blood flow to the surface of the skin. This is involuntary or smooth muscle, and it carries out what's called vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vaso means vascular or blood supply. So these are muscles that are associated with the small blood vessels known as arterioles and venules that carry oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. If something constricts, it tightens. So think of a boa constrictor and how they squeeze. So if you constrict blood, that decreases blood flow. So think about if you're really cold, for example, you feel your skin and it's going to be cold in temperature. And when your body gets cold, it tends to reduce the amount of blood that's flowing to the surface of the body. This is a way of reducing heat loss, all right? And it's going to give your skin a very whitish look or a pale look if you're darker skinned, because you're going to lose that rosy red glow. The other side of the coin is vasodilation. So if something dilates, it opens. So if you open the blood supply, you're going to get increased blood flow to the skin. And that's what I talked about with you maybe flushing red from heat or embarrassment. Okay, so vasoconstriction and vasodilation are caused by smooth muscles that are going to be associated with the blood supply. More on that later when we get into the blood supply and the vessels. All right, now the dermis has two layers, but they're not as easy to distinguish from one another as the layers of the epidermis. The layers of the epidermis were pretty clear. You could really see them. For these layers, it's a little more of it's a little grayer area, but the top portion of the dermis here is known as the papillary layer. Papillary or papilla mean bumps, okay? So the bumps in question are these bumps right here. If you go back to this image for a moment, do you see how in this diagram they've separated the epidermis from the dermis? And that shows these bumps called dermal papilla. Okay, and they exactly match up with these ridges of the epidermis. And so if you lay this epidermis down, you'd see that the two layers interlock, kind of like what you can achieve if you take empty egg cartons and stack them one on top of another. Okay, you can make a big stack of egg cartons because they will interlock. So these papilla and ridges give you more of that same physical property surface area and really help to connect the epidermis to the dermis, all right? So the papillary layer is the superficial layer of the dermis, and it includes those papilla that I just described. If you were to look here, this is an SEM, a scanning electron microscope view of the dermis in the papillary layer. And what we see are the individual protein fibers. Okay, now let's compare for a moment this SEM of the deeper layer. Now this to me looks kind of like a carpet. You see all those many protein fibers. It's absolutely packed and they look pretty strong, right? Go back here and you'll see fewer protein fibers and they're not really as tightly organized. Okay, it doesn't have that same look as like a carpet. What's going on here is the papillary layer, it has a reduced concentration of the protein fibers. Okay, it's not as packed with protein fibers as the deeper reticular layer is. All right? So superficial layer is referred to as papillary. The deep layer is referred to as reticular. The papillary layer has the dermal papilla, and these interlock with the epidermal ridges above. And the function of this design, as I mentioned, is to give greater surface area, which allows for the movement of the smaller molecules that are capable of passing over this basement membrane, but also helps to resist friction. So if you rub hard enough against the skin, you can't separate these two layers, and that would be known as a blister. All right, so you've all had blisters before from something rubbing. Okay, so normally though, this high area of surface area helps to reduce the likelihood that the epidermis and the dermis will separate. All right, the deeper reticular layer, as I said, more protein, particularly collagen. And the collagen, that's what you're seeing right here, this one that looks a bit like a piece of yarn that's unraveling, that's collagen. And we know that collagen is very strong. So this deeper reticular layer is particularly strong. Now there's no hard line, there's just a general area here where it changes over from less protein fiber to more protein fiber, okay? Now, these protein fibers that are found in the dermis, particularly when we're talking about collagen, when collagen gets to be in a high concentration, when you get a lot of it, we know from looking at things like dense regular connective tissue that the collagen fibers tend to line up. So if you have a tissue with lots of collagen fibers, the collagen fibers will have a direction, an orientation. Okay, so this term lines of cleavage refers to the predominant orientation of collagen fiber bundles. So how do these collagen bundles all line up? They tend to line up together. Look at the human body. We can actually map out these lines of cleavage, and they're different in different areas of the body. So let's look here at the crural region. Remember that term, right? You can see the orientation is in kind of an up and down direction. But if we go here to the thoracic region, now the orientation has changed from up and down to horizontal. It goes this way. Now, the important thing about these lines of cleavage is seen in a couple of medical issues. First of all, if somebody gets an injury or if you're going to do surgery on an individual, you need to know these orientation lines because they're going to affect how a patient heals. Here we have an incision that's perpendicular to the lines of cleavage. That is, we've cut the bundles of collagen basically at right angles. We cut right across them. And when you cut collagen, it's going to shorten up. So this means that an incision like this has a tendency to heal slowly. It might rip out stitches, and it might leave a bigger scar. Now, you can't always control where an injury ends up. Obviously, if your patient has already got an injury, then you'll have to stitch it up as best you can, but you might want to put in more stitches. You might want to use a stronger suture material. On the other hand, if you're going to cut into somebody, it's better to go in the same direction as the lines of cleavage. That is going to allow minimal scarring, and it's less likely that your suture material will rip out. Okay, so if you get into a surgical practice, you're going to need to be aware of these lines of cleavage. We also see the effects of lines of cleavage when we look at stretch marks. Now, stretch marks occur when a human being grows quickly. This can happen at puberty, so it's very common to see stretch marks across the back, right here, because you're growing this way, and it pulls the collagen apart. And collagen fibers, when they tear, leave a stretch mark. So if you have any growth marks, they might be on your back, sometimes they're on people's shoulders, or it's not uncommon for pregnant women to develop stretch marks because their abdomen grows quite quickly when the baby gets large towards the, usually in the 3rd trimester. This has a lot to do with genetics. Some people will never form stretch marks. Some people form them very, very easily. And I always like to make the point that putting creams on your skin is not going to prevent stretch marks, because now think about what you understand about collagen. Collagen is down in the dermis. It is very difficult for molecules to penetrate down into the dermis. So if you put cream on your skin, how likely do you think it is that that cream is going to penetrate through all the layers of your epidermis down into your dermis? That's pretty unlikely, don't you think? And any chemical that would do that would be a little bit frightening. What those creams can do is just make it less itchy, because most people find their skin is very dry and itchy when they're growing rapidly like that. But I hate to tell you, you are not going to prevent stretch marks by putting cream on your abdomen when you're pregnant. Okay, it doesn't work. All right, now hair. I said hair is associated with thin skin, and thin skin covers most of the body. Okay, so we have hair all over our body, but we actually have several different types of hair, which is unusual for an animal. The hair on top of your head is really different from the hair on your arm, which is really different from the hair in the pubic region. Okay, they're all quite different. All right, so where does hair come from? Well, I said it's from the dermis, right? You see it down here, but hold on a minute. Follow this line here. Okay, this is my basal lamina right here. And notice it reached this point, and now it's going deep down. And you can see that all of this is actually epithelium. So although the hair comes from deep in the dermis, the tissue itself is epidermal tissue. So this is epidermis. Okay, so trying to fool you a little bit here. The growth of the hair comes from deep down at the base of the shaft. Okay, and then as the hair grows, it pushes up and eventually through the surface of the skin where we can see it. Now, attached to the hairs of this that we're looking at on the skin is a muscle called an erector pili. This muscle is involuntary, so it's smooth. So what do you think happens when this muscle shortens? Well, when the erector pili muscle contracts, it's going to cause the hair to go up. We call this goosebumps. Okay, now that happens in animals to keep them warm. So you might have seen this. Sometimes I've seen birds in the morning, they're outside, they're cold, they fluff their feathers. That's the same reaction. You might see an animal that's chilly, puff up, but more often you see an animal that's mad or frightened puff up. So your cat may puff its fur up because your dog is harassing it or something like that. That happens sometimes in my house. If the dog startles the cat puffs up. And so what happens is the erector pili muscle contracts, raises up the shafts of the hair, and it makes the animal look larger. And that helps the animal to get rid of any scary predator types who might be trying to eat it. Or if you're cold, by raising up your fur, you trap heat, body heat, against the surface of the skin. So an animal that puffs up when they're cold is effectively holding on to some of their body heat. Now in humans, we don't do either. We don't look bigger when we do that, and we don't stay warm when we do that. It's kind of a leftover from our evolution. Okay, that's all due to this one type of muscle. All right, so the base of the hair, way down here where the growth occurs, is called the hair bulb. And so that's going to be epithelial cells that are undergoing rapid mitosis. So really, hair cells are simply modified skin cells. Okay, so the stuff on the top of your head that you cut or dye or do whatever is really very similar to the skin cells that you can touch on the surface of your body. And as such, they are filled with keratin, just like the skin cells of your body. If you look closely, this is an SEM, you can see how the individual cells overlap. Okay, and this overlap is called the cuticle. And so if you were to dye your hair, what we're doing are depositing molecules of color here in the areas where the cuticle overlaps. So all of this stuff is dead. The only living part of a cell is down here at the base of the hair bulb, and we have rapid mitosis occurring here, just like you have rapid mitosis in the stratum germinativum. Okay. All right, we categorize the types of hair on the body as vellus, intermediate, and terminal. Vellus is the primary hair that you see on your body. So it's a little fine fuzzy hair that's on your skin, all over your thin skin. It's also a name given to the hair that you see on a baby's body when they're first born. As you get older and hit puberty, some of the hair on the legs and the arm will lengthen and start growing as it's more obvious. It darkens, it gets coarser, and that's referred to as intermediate hair. And then finally, terminal hair, which includes the hair on our head, but also at and beyond puberty. Terminal hair includes the axillary region, so your armpit hair, and the genital region. So there's hair around the pubic region and also around the anal region. Okay. The color of your hair is due to the amount and type of melanin that is produced by the cells undergoing mitosis in your hair bulb. So the same genes that control your skin color are also going to help determine your hair color. Variations in hair color, like I said, different types of melanin. So some people have melanin that will look red on hair, some melanin will look black on hair. It just depends on the type of melanin. Hair can be quite sensitive. So sometimes people will lose hair temporarily. Certain drugs can cause this. We've seen that, for example, with drugs that treat cancer. So chemotherapy drugs can cause hair to fall out. Dietary factors. So if a person undergoes a period of starvation or extreme dietary deprivation, where they say don't have much protein, that can cause the hair to thin out. Radiation, exposure to radiation can. Hopefully that's not something that most of you have experienced. High fever, particularly, actually at any age, a high fever can interrupt hair growth and cause hair to fall out. And stress. Okay, so these are temporary hair losses. Okay, permanent or irreversible thinning of the hair occurs in both sexes, usually as a result of aging. So as hormone levels change, both men and women will get less hair. But that's talking about head hair, terminal hair. This is not the same thing as what's often called like male pattern baldness. That is genetic. Okay, women can also be affected by baldness, but that's not what I'm talking about here. This is just an overall loss of hair that's part of the aging process. All right. Now, going back to sebaceous glands. If you remember, we studied those earlier, and I described those as an exocrine gland. So that means that the secretion, sebum, made by sebaceous glands is going to be spread onto an apical surface. And remember, the sebaceous glands are holocrine glands, and so to release their product, sebum, the entire mature cell will break down. So where do we find sebaceous glands? Well, see, it looks kind of like a cluster of grapes attached to the shaft of the hair, to the outside of the shaft. Okay, so the sebum is going to leave the sebaceous glands and then pass through the same opening as the hair. Sebaceous glands are particularly active around and following puberty. The oil, the sebum that's produced, ironically, actually helps to prevent bacterial growth. So the sebum that spreads across your skin makes it less likely that you'll get a bacterial skin infection. However, because we have so much sebum, especially around puberty, it can block this opening, this pore. And if that happens, bacteria that are trapped inside the pore will multiply, and that leads to acne. So around puberty, we all have too much sebum. But as you get older, you get less and less activity of the sebaceous gland. So elderly people tend not to have enough sebum, and that makes them more likely to get bacterial infections of the skin. Okay. Another exocrine gland that we have not talked about yet are the sweat glands. Okay, so sweat glands are an exocrine gland, and I want you to notice here, look at the diagram, we have two types. We have one sweat gland that's again associated with the hair follicle, and another sweat gland over here that opens directly onto the surface of the skin. The one associated with the hair is known as an apocrine sweat gland, and the one going to the surface of the skin is a merocrine sweat gland. Now, if you remember, the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands release their product in one way, just through exocytosis, and the apocrine glands release their product in another way. So when these were first described, it was thought that that was true, that merocrine sweat glands act like a merocrine gland, and apocrine sweat glands act like an apocrine gland. That would be the obvious thing. But actually, the apocrine sweat gland is not an apocrine gland, which is a really, really confusing thing. So that's why I'm making a big deal about it, so you'll understand. All sweat glands work through exocytosis, all right? There is no apocrine version of a sweat gland. It's a misnamed gland. The apocrine sweat glands are found in the armpits, the areola, that's the area around the nipple, the groin, and the anus. So these are the ones that we associate with sexual maturity in adults. The product of the apocrine sweat glands have a stronger odor, okay, and they activate at puberty. So if you've ever grown up with individuals as they were passing through puberty, you have children or you had siblings, you might have noticed a rather dramatic sudden shift in their smell. Depends on the person. Some people never produce much smell. Some produce quite a lot. It really depends, again, on diet, genetics, and how often you bathe. So these are the ones that are going to ramp up when you hit puberty and become active. The merocrine or eccrine sweat glands, because remember these two are both used to describe exocrine glands that release secretions by exocytosis. These sweat glands are far more common. Okay, you have lots and lots of them on the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet. So if you're somebody who gets sweaty hands when you're nervous, that just means you have very active merocrine sweat glands. The sweat that is produced here tends to be much less smelly. So little kids can sweat a lot and have little, if any, BO, but then they hit puberty and that can change. So this product is almost all water with salt and other things, including the urea that I mentioned earlier. Sweat is primarily used for thermoregulation, to cool off, but sweat also acts as a natural antimicrobial because microbes, like bacteria, things like that, don't like salt water. So by having a lot of this sweat on your skin, it actually protects you. And as I mentioned before, this idea of waste secretion, so getting rid of extra nitrogen in the form of urea. That's one of the functions of sweat. So remember, these merocrine sweat glands just go straight to the surface of the skin. There's a little pore right here. And the apocrine sweat glands are associated with the hair. All right. Just to finish up with the exocrine glands that are associated with the dermis. Again, remember, these are all actually derived from epithelial tissue. They're just folded down deep into the dermis. It's not dermal tissue exactly. Okay, so these exocrine glands that are down in the dermis also include the ceruminous glands and the mammary glands. Ceruminous glands make a product called cerumen, which is an anatomical term for earwax. So inside of the duct leading into your tympanic membrane, it's lined with these ceruminous glands, And the product, cerumen, actually evolved from sweat glands. So the earwax that we have is actually something that evolved from sweat. These modified sweat glands help to, again, protect the inside of the ear and discourage bacterial growth. Finally, we've got our mammary glands, and these are actually apocrine glands. The products made by mammary glands are milk and colostrum. And so you can see that these exocrine glands occur in sort of these lobular arrangements. So you have a cluster of them that lead to a single opening, and then another cluster over here leading to a separate opening. So there's a number of different openings for the mammary glands, and these are found in the region of the areola and the nipple itself. Okay. All right, is there anything else I want to add here? No, I don't think so. All right, your nails. It shouldn't be too surprising, now that you know that hair is like skin, to realize that nails are also like skin. Your nails are, again, modified epidermis. And so we have dead cells filled with keratin, just like your hair is made up of dead cells filled with keratin, just as the surface of your skin is made up of dead cells filled with keratin. The living part of the nail is called the nail root. So remember, the hair had the hair bulb, that's where mitosis takes place. The nail has the nail root. So if you look here at a section through a nail, all of this portion of the nail is dead. Oops, sorry. The living portion is here, maybe a millimeter or so back from the cuticle. You might have found this out if you've accidentally ever whacked yourself in the finger or closed your finger in a door. If you do that off the nail, but just a little bit in that base of the nail, you can really damage the nail. You can have a nail fall off, things like that. So here, right here, that's your nail root. That's where mitosis happens. New cells are made there and then pushed forward by other new cells that are being formed by mitosis. These cells fill with keratin, die, and are just pushed forward. Okay, so all of the cells here on the nail are dead. This is, again, epidermis. Even though it goes all the way down into the level of the dermis, this is not dermal tissue. The nails are thought to help to protect the exposed distal tips of the finger. So again, if you think about humans climbing around, moving around the environment, the nail has a protective function. And you can see nails like this in other great apes as well, and other monkeys and other things that use their fingers for climbing. All right, so the last thing I want to say about skin, about the sorry, lost my train of thought for a minute. Okay, about the epithelial tissues and the dermal tissues, the integumentary system, is that it's the most common site of cancer. So skin cancers are the most common type of cancers that are diagnosed in the US. And of those, the most common variety is called basal cell carcinoma. So you know that the basal cells are the stem cells that are found in the stratum germinativum, and they undergo rapid mitosis. Well, one of the things we know about cancers is that we see rapid mitosis. So this is a type of cell that is really prone to having even more rapid mitosis. What causes skin cancer? The greatest risk factor that we have is exposure to UV radiation. And this is usually something that happens to us when we're children, because little kids are the ones who will stay in the pool for 6 hours or run around at the beach for, the entire day. Most adults get tired and go inside or sit under umbrellas, things like that, but little kids will keep going. So if you've had some nasty sunburn when you were a child, and most particularly if you are lighter skinned, then you have to be very careful and keep an eye out for any changes to the skin that might indicate skin cancers. So anything that is abnormal, changes color, changes texture, starts to grow, anything like that, you should show somebody. If it's dark in color, that can also be a real indication The worst kind, the scariest kind of skin cancer to get is melanoma. Melanoma is cancer of the melanocytes. So the dark color comes from that melanocyte, but melanoma is very prone to moving from its initial site to other parts of the body. The more common basal cell carcinoma, luckily, very rarely moves around. So it's not a particularly dangerous cancer, and these are often easily removed by a dermatologist. Of course, you can get cancers too of those keratinocytes I described, the cells that we saw in that stratum spinosum. Those are keratinocytes. They're going to fill up with keratin, and those too can accumulate enough mutations, usually due to UV radiation, so that they can become cancerous. All right, so it's always important to check out your skin or the skin of your loved ones, and if you see any unusual changes, to get that checked out pretty quickly. All right, so that's completing the lecture. This is covered in your textbook, Chapter 5 on the integumentary system. Listen to the parts again that you missed or had questions on. Write down your questions. Remember, you can send those to me via email, or you can wait. We could talk about them on Zoom or in office hours. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.